In the summer of 1931, a city of 1.5 million people vanished under 16 feet of water and stayed there for 4 months. Not a tsunami, not a hurricane, a river. By the time it was over, somewhere between 1 and 4 million people were dead. Nobody agrees on the number because nobody could count fast enough. It is, by every serious historical estimate, the deadliest natural disaster ever recorded. You've probably never heard of it. 1931. The flood that drowned the nation. Section 1. The setup. A land already bleeding. To understand why this flood became a catastrophe instead of just a disaster, you have to understand what China looked like in 1930. The country was already on its knees. Warlord conflicts were tearing the interior apart. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was fighting a civil war against communist forces in the countryside. And nature had spent 3 straight years setting a trap. 1928 to 1930 brought one of the worst droughts in decades across central China. Fields cracked, reservoirs emptied, and desperate farmers cut down trees and stripped bare hillsides just to survive, destroying the natural drainage that normally absorbed floodwater. Then the drought broke, violently. The winter of 1930 into 1931 dumped record snowfall across the mountains that feed the Yangtze River. When spring came, that snow didn't just melt, it surged. And then the sky did something almost unheard of. In July 1931 alone, 9 separate cyclones tracked into the Yangtze Basin in a single season. The historical average is 2. The river had nowhere to put all that water, except everywhere. Section 2. The Wall of Water. By July, the Yangtze and its sister river, the Huai, were no longer rivers. They were an inland sea. Water levels at Hangzhou, one of the 3 towns of Wuhan, and at the time one of the largest cities in China, rose more than 16 meters above normal. Dikes that had held for generations failed one after another, not gradually but in sudden, catastrophic collapses that sent walls of water through villages with almost no warning. The flood didn't just cover farmland. It swallowed an area estimated at 180,000 to nearly 300,000 square kilometers, bigger than the entire United Kingdom. Estimates of the population affected range up to 51 million people. At the time, roughly the population of Spain, France, and Portugal combined, all displaced or endangered at once. Wuhan itself sat underwater for almost 4 months. Streets became canals. People lived on rooftops, on the upper floors of buildings, on rafts made of doors and furniture. Foreign journalists who visited by boat described entire neighborhoods where only the tiled roofs of houses broke the surface, smoke still rising from cooking fires lit on the tiles because there was nowhere else to cook. This is usually where a story like this would end: the dramatic flood, the rescue, the recovery. This is not where this story ends. This is where it gets worse.
Section 3. The false floor. What actually killed them? Here's the number that gets repeated the most. Roughly 145,000 people drowned in the initial flooding. That number is real. It is also, historians argue, a fraction of the true death toll, because drowning was not the main killer. It was only the opening act. With farmland underwater for months, the autumn harvest simply didn't happen. Millions of people who survived the flood now faced no food at all, in a region where famine had already been a recent memory. Relief boats existed, but corruption, warlord roadblocks, and a government stretched thin by civil war meant grain often rotted in warehouses or was diverted before it reached the starving. Then came the second wave: disease. Standing floodwater mixed with sewage, corpses, and drinking water into the same soup. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery tore through refugee camps where hundreds of thousands of people were packed onto levees, rooftops, and the rare patches of dry ground. In some relief camps, disease killed faster than the flood itself had. And in the worst-hit rural counties, missionary and relief worker accounts, corroborated later by historians, documented families reduced to eating bark, leaves, and in the most extreme, undocumented cases whispered about at the time, each other. Whether the flood killed 145,000 or closer to 4 million depends entirely on which of these 3 waves you count: the water, the hunger, or the disease. Most serious modern historians now believe the true toll lands somewhere between 1 and 2 million, making the water itself almost the least deadly part of the disaster. Section 4. a government drowning too. While people were dying by the hundreds of thousands, Chiang Kai-shek's government was fighting for its own survival, militarily and politically. Relief efforts were organized. The National Flood Relief Commission was formed, and it did move real aid, including international loans and wheat shipments from the United States. But the commission was working inside a state that couldn't fully police its own territory. Warlord generals in some provinces blocked relief convoys they didn't control. Local officials skimmed relief funds. Boats meant to distribute grain were sometimes seized by armed groups before they reached the camps that needed them most. Foreign press coverage at the time, from American and British reporters who traveled the flood zone by boat, described a government simply overwhelmed by the scale of what it was facing, and a country where the state's reach into the countryside had never been strong to begin with. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in history's deadliest disasters. The water is often survivable. It's the systems that are supposed to respond to it that decide how many people actually die. Section 5. Why you've never heard of this. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. The 1931 China floods killed more people than World War I, more than the Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, and the Chernobyl disaster combined many times over. And yet it barely registers in Western textbooks, documentaries, or classrooms. Part of it is timing. 1931 was a year already dominated in Western headlines by the Great Depression. Part of it is that within a decade, China would be consumed by full-scale war with Japan, then civil war, then decades of political upheaval that made 1931 feel like ancient history, even to the Chinese state itself. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in history's deadliest disasters. The water is often survivable. It's the systems that are supposed to respond to it that decide how many people actually die.
There was no unified narrative, no single government still in power to memorialize it the way nations usually memorialize their disasters. A catastrophe this size simply got buried under everything that came after it. Somewhere in central China, there are still elderly stories passed down, not written in any textbook, about a summer when the river didn't rise. It just kept rising for 4 months until an area the size of England simply stopped being land. The deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history didn't end with a bang. It ended slowly, in silence, one starving village at a time.